And joining us now here on the program, we have Curt Covington. He's the Senior Director of Partner Relations at Ag America. Curt, great to have you on the show with us today. How are you, sir?
Good, Jess. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I appreciate the time. Let's dive right in. We're talking farmland and we're talking ownership of farmland, whether that be by an older generation, younger generation, foreign ownership. We have the interest rate issues here in front of us as well. There is a lot that is kind of going on behind the scenes of farmland transactions right now in the U.S., isn't there, Curt?
There really is. And, the challenge with all this is if you go back, just say through the last decade, the challenge always was, well, what's driving land values to continue to increase in some areas of the country, 6% a year, other areas, 10% a year? What's driving that? There's the one group that says, well, really good commodity prices tend to drive land prices. And the other group that says really low interest rates makes buying land a pretty cheap investment. And I would say we're experiencing today a little bit of both. Although I would say if you had to weigh this out and say which one has been historically the driver for increasing land values, has been historically low interest rates.
I would agree with that. And as we look at the Fed and examine their interest rate hikes, we continue to see them inflation running rampant. In your thoughts, how is this going to affect agricultural lending and farmland values and more moving forward, Curt?
So whether it's the local farmer, whether it's an investor in that land, interest rates drive and make the decisions. The Fed is talking about a 0.75% rate hike. We're already seeing a slowdown in acquisition financing of real estate. We're also actually seeing a decline in the refinance activity of many of our farmers. And that's just with a 50 basis point rate hike. There are two things driving this. One, if rates go up another 0.75 basis point, I think it does put a damper on the growth in land acquisitions and probably will start to dampen the price of some of these transactions across the U.S. There's another piece to this, Jess, as well, that we really aren't talking about. It's the confluence of rising rates and input inflation, right? Farmers today are paying on average, and again, I do business across the United States. Some people tell me my input costs are up 40%, and I bought early, right? I bought early. Some people are telling me, that's not even close. Out here in California, my labor costs are up 25% if I can find it. Plus my input costs are up. It's closer to 50% increase. So the combination, I think, are scaring off buyers and are also scaring off refinances.
I would agree with that. And you throw on top of that, this is not an issue that's only affecting established farmers and ranchers, but think about younger farmers that want to try to build up more of their operation. They want to buy more farmland, millennials, etc. It's making it really tough for them to get started in agriculture right now, Curt.
There's really not a great solution to this. The United States government has attempted to do this, through some of their small beginning and young farmer programs. The reality of the matter is, unless you're willing to provide more than 100%, in some cases, financing of that acquisition, most young beginning and small farmers don't have the necessary capital. And even if it's a 10% down transaction, they don't have that kind of cash to come up with. Now, there are some innovative things that AgAmerica is doing, which is we refer to it as one of our launch products, which is helping young and beginning small farmers put a small down payment on lease that we'll buy the property. You lease it from us with a promise to buy that property at the end of the lease transaction 5, 6, 7 years down the road. But again, I think a lot of young people today look at this and say, as much as I'd like to be in this business, or as much as I would like to grow my footprint in this business, these input costs are killing me.
Yeah, very, very true. I hear that as well from farmers and ranchers across the country on a day-to-day basis, Kurt. And as well, we see that younger farmers maybe don't have the ability to or don't know that there are ways that they can get into buying more farmland, et cetera. It feels like that's opening things up for more foreign investment. And I know this is an issue. We've been hearing a lot about this, hearing about a Chinese company buying land near Grand Forks, North Dakota, for example, or et cetera, talk in Congress about barring certain countries from buying U.S. agricultural land. As you look at that side of the issue, Kurt, what are your thoughts there? What stands out to you with this foreign investment issue we're talking about?
I think the foreign investment issue always comes to the forefront when you get into these positions, because most foreign investors don't look at that investment like you and I would look at that investment that says, if I go borrow the money at some rate, I've got to get some kind of return off that crop or off that dairy or off that feedlot that pays for my cost of doing business, which is my interest cost plus my input cost. A lot of these foreign buyers don't look at it that way. They look at it simply as an opportunity to buy a high quality hard asset that is a hedge against inflation, and in some cases, could potentially provide them a source of input costs, or grain, source places they can source their grain or other products to export back to their country. The other group that you see in this also is the private equity groups, right? And the private equity groups typically tend to look at the graying of rural America, the term that's used, the graying of rural America, and see, farmers that are my age, and I'm still farming out in California, but 60 and 70-year-olds who have maybe no kids in the business that want to take this business over. They really don't have a desire necessarily to lease that ground out and become a landlord. And so the private equity comes in and offers them a nice kind of parachute for that. Again, they've been really aggressive, but we also see they look at this and say, well, wait a minute, timeout. Costs, my cost of doing business is going up just like any farmer's cost of business is. So the private equity component of this, I think, is probably going to slow down a bit as well.
Yeah, you bring up the private equity component as well, and I think of someone such as Bill Gates, who is out here buying a lot of agricultural land across the US. A lot of folks are talking about that. I know that's a headline name, but to your point, that's a lot of what we're seeing. And I know as well, I think it's 40% or so of US farmlands owned by folks over the age of 65. So, you think about that and all those private, equities and foreign investment, some of those groups, they're also have the ability to just price people out of some of this farmland, Kurt.
Well, there's probably a third group there that we haven't talked about, and that is the high net worth individual doesn't realize that we're potentially headed for a recession here, that doesn't really care what interest rates are, that didn't care that corn was $2.85 just 3 or 4 short years ago, that doesn't know really anything other than that land is a store of value and a hedge against inflation. And for them, a high net worth individual purchasing land, as you had just indicated, the Bill Gates or Bill Gates Foundation, I'm not sure which, probably looks at this as not as an investment like you and I would, but simply being a place to park his money and have a good hedge against inflation.
And that's what a lot of it is about. And again, it's an issue that we're going to be watching closely. Obviously, it's going to be tied to, as you mentioned, that hedge against inflation, the recession talk, et cetera, whether some things change in Congress or not on the foreign side. As we look at everything, though, Kurt, you mentioned this earlier, some of the resources that Ag America has for folks to invest and build up their farmland assets. If you look at what you guys are doing as a company, any other final thoughts you'd want to share with us? Anything just to kind of encourage some folks out there listening who are maybe worried about getting priced out of some farmland right now?
Well, that's a great question. I guess, there's always the statement, there's no time like the present. I would say that, if I were, whether I'm a young and maybe people aren't going to want to hear this, but particularly people in my industry, given what I think is potentially some very volatile times coming ahead when it comes to inflation, interest rate environment, is today a great day to be out making a decision to go and put your fortunes on the line and buy a piece of property and either expand your operation or get into the business? My response to them is that AgAmerica is a great resource if you just want to talk to us, because we can tell that farmer, whether it's a young beginning small farmer, an old, long-time farmer, somebody that's looking to expand their operation, ask the question, what's your advice? What's your advice, AgAmerica, in terms of what should happen? And so there's nothing more important than having that communication with the banker, and because a banker will tell you what he sees or what she sees in the market, what he sees in the market, and will happily share that information with you and help you make what I think is an educated decision. Sometimes it's not always about just finding a way to make you a loan. Sometimes it's sitting back and saying, maybe this isn't the best time to be making this decision. And so it's just harder and harder and harder for these young farmers to enter the market. This is just going to be a very difficult time for them without assistance from, perhaps their parents or some related party that can help them, help them at least partially finance the transaction.
Well, a lot of things to consider, and folks can learn more. AgAmerica.com. Reach out to you folks there and your team and talk with you guys and more. And Curt, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining us here today on the show. And it's a topic we'll be watching closely. We'll look forward to talking more again soon.
Great. Thanks, Jess.
Curt Covington with AgAmerica joining us here on today's Market Talk.